"Who told you to hide yourself?" The ruthless Mafia boss's voice echoed through the crowded ballroom, silencing every conversation. Near the back wall, a plus-size housekeeper lowered her eyes, wrapped inside an oversized grey coat that looked as though it belonged to someone else. The guests laughed quietly. They assumed she was ashamed of her body. The Mafia boss walked straight toward her. Without warning, he grabbed the loose sleeve of the coat. One sharp pull. The old stitching split apart. The room gasped. Several guards reached for their weapons, believing she had made a terrible mistake. Instead, the Mafia boss stared at the faded name tag sewn inside the torn coat. It wasn't hers. Someone had forced her to wear another servant's discarded uniform. His face turned ice cold. Then he gave an order that no one expected. "Bring every tailor in this city. From today forward. No one decides what she is worth except me." The ballroom fell silent. More than 200 guests watched as the ripped sleeve of the oversized grey coat slipped from the young maid's shoulder. She instinctively pulled the fabric back into place, her face burning with embarrassment. She wasn't afraid of the tear. She was afraid of everyone's eyes. Standing before her was Lucian Ashcroft, the ruthless Mafia boss, whose name alone could silence an entire room. No one understood why he had suddenly grabbed the loose sleeve of a maid's worn-out coat. Lucian ignored the whispers. His attention was fixed on the faded cloth label hidden inside the torn lining. He read it once, then again. The name stitched into the fabric wasn't Elara Quinn. It belonged to someone else. His expression hardened. Who issued this uniform? No one answered. A long, uncomfortable silence settled over the ballroom. Finally, the estate manager, Victor Hale, stepped forward with a practiced smile. "It was only a temporary replacement, sir. The new uniforms are still being prepared." Lucian slowly lifted his eyes. "Temporary?" Victor nodded. "Yes, sir." Without another word, Lucian turned the torn coat inside out. His fingers traced the faded seams. The cloth had been patched several times. The cuffs were badly frayed. One pocket had been sewn back together with thread that didn't even match the original fabric. This coat wasn't made for her. His calm voice echoed through the room. It wasn't even made this decade. Several guests shifted uneasily. Lucian looked back at Elara. "How long have you worked here?" 11 months, sir." "And you've worn this every day?" She hesitated before giving a small nod. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "They told me there wasn't a uniform in my size." Her answer came so naturally that it sounded rehearsed. Almost as if she had repeated it to herself hundreds of times. Lucian studied her quietly. The oversized coat hid almost everything about her. Not only her figure, it hid her confidence, her posture. Even the way she walked. She had spent nearly a year trying to become invisible. "Did you ever ask for another one?" Elara offered a timid smile. "I didn't want anyone to think I was being difficult." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged awkward glances. No one had expected such a simple answer. Lucian slowly turned toward Victor again. "When was the staff uniform budget approved?" Victor answered immediately. "Last spring." "And the amount?" Victor hesitated. I'd have to check the records." "You won't." Lucian's voice remained perfectly calm. "Because I already know the amount." The room grew even quieter. He took one measured step closer. The budget was large enough to replace every uniform in this estate. Victor's smile finally disappeared. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Lucian looked around the ballroom, making sure every employee and every guest could hear his next words. "A woman has worked in my home for almost a year, wearing someone else's discarded uniform. No one reported it. No one questioned it. And somehow, everyone decided that was normal." His gaze returned to the torn coat in Elara's hands. This was never about clothing. He looked directly at Victor. It was about deciding who deserved dignity. For the first time since entering the ballroom, Victor looked genuinely nervous. Lucien turned to his security chief without taking his eyes off the estate manager. "Gideon, seal the accounting office." "No one touches a single document." Victor's face turned pale, because in that moment, he realized the ripped coat was no longer the biggest problem in the mansion. It was the first piece of evidence. By midnight, the ballroom had emptied. Lucien's order spread through the Ashcroft estate faster than any rumor. No financial records could be removed. No employee was allowed to leave. No one questioned him. When Lucien gave an order, people obeyed. Inside the accounting office, Gideon Cross quietly placed stacks of ledgers across a long wooden table. "There are 7 years of uniform expenses," he said. Lucien opened the first ledger. Every page showed the same thing. Budgets approved. Payments completed. Receipts signed. On paper, every employee had received new uniforms exactly as scheduled. Yet 11 months earlier, a young maid had arrived and been told there wasn't one available in her size. Someone had lied. Lucien closed the ledger. "I want to know when she started working here." Gideon nodded. "I'll bring her personnel file. 11 months earlier." Alara Quinn arrived at Ashcroft Estate, carrying everything she owned inside one faded canvas bag. She had worked dozens of temporary jobs before. Hotels, cafes, laundry services. Every interview usually ended the same way. "We'll call you." No one ever did. When Ashcroft Estate offered her a position as a maid, she accepted immediately. She promised herself she would never complain. Not about the hours. Not about the workload. Not even about the way people looked at her. On her first morning, Victor Hale welcomed the new employees with a practiced smile. Uniforms are mandatory. Each new maid received a neatly folded package. Each, except Alara. Victor looked her up and down before speaking. "We don't have your size." Several employees glanced toward her before quickly looking away. "I can wait," Alara answered politely. Victor smiled. "No need." He walked to a storage cabinet and pulled out an old gray uniform. The fabric looked faded. The sleeves were noticeably too long. It belonged to someone who no longer works here. It should fit well enough. A few maids exchanged uneasy looks. One whispered, "That's Amanda's old uniform." Another quietly replied, "They never throw anything away." Alara pretended not to hear. She thanked Victor, took the uniform, and walked to the changing room. The coat hung awkwardly from her shoulders. The waist sat too low. The sleeves covered half her hands. Looking at herself in the mirror, she forced a smile. "It's only work," she whispered. "It doesn't matter." From that day forward, she became almost invisible. Guests remembered the polished silver, the spotless floors, the perfect service. No one remembered the maid wearing clothes that never belonged to her, except one person. Lucien had seen her before. Not once, not twice. Dozens of times. He simply hadn't realized what he was looking at. Until tonight. Back in the present, Gideon placed a thin personnel file on the desk. Lucien opened it. Tucked inside was a single handwritten request. Uniform size adjustment. Status: denied. Reason: no budget available. Lucien stared at the signature authorizing the rejection. Victor Hale. He slowly closed the file. His voice remained calm. "Bring Victor to my office." Gideon hesitated. "Now?" Lucien looked out toward the dark estate. "Before he has time to destroy whatever he's trying to hide." Victor Hale arrived at Lucien's office just after midnight. He looked calm. Too calm. Almost as if he had already prepared an explanation. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Lucien didn't answer immediately. He closed the personnel file and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate. When was the last time you actually looked at the people working in this house? Victor frowned. I don't understand. Lucien turned. I didn't ask if you understood. I asked when. Victor remained silent. After several uncomfortable seconds, Lucien dismissed him. Don't leave the estate. We're not finished. As the office door closed, Gideon stepped forward. You think he's hiding something? Lucien's answer came without hesitation. I think he's hiding much more than missing uniforms. The next morning, the mansion returned to its usual rhythm. Guests enjoyed breakfast. Staff polished silver trays. Gardeners trimmed the hedges. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Except Lucien was paying attention for the first time. He watched Alara from the second-floor balcony. She moved carefully through the dining room, carrying a heavy serving tray. Instead of walking confidently, she kept pulling the oversized sleeves away from her hands. Twice, the loose fabric caught against chairbacks. Once, she nearly dropped an expensive tea set, trying to keep the coat from slipping off her shoulder. She wasn't clumsy. She was working inside clothes that had never been made for her. Lucien noticed something else. Every time guests walked past, Alara instinctively stepped sideways, making herself smaller, avoiding eye contact, almost apologizing for taking up space. Later that afternoon, Lucien found Gideon reviewing security footage from the previous month. I need every recording that includes Alara. Gideon looked surprised. Just her? Just her. An hour later, they sat in the security room, watching dozens of silent recordings. Hallways, kitchens, storage rooms, laundry areas. The pattern appeared almost immediately. Whenever other employees gathered together, Alara quietly chose another route. Whenever there was a staff meal, she waited until everyone else had finished before entering the dining room. When uniforms were distributed to new employees, she stood at the back, watching, never asking, never complaining. Gideon leaned forward. She acts like she's trying not to exist. Lucien didn't answer. Because he had reached the same conclusion. The oversized coat hadn't taught Alara to hide. It had simply become another way to disappear. Then one recording caught his attention. It had been filmed 6 months earlier. A group of young maids stood laughing near the laundry room. One of them held up a brand new uniform. Another pointed toward Alara's oversized coat before whispering something. The entire group laughed. Alara smiled politely, pretended not to hear, then quietly walked away carrying a basket of clean towels. She never defended herself. She never cried. She simply accepted it. Lucien slowly paused the recording. His jaw tightened. Who are they? Gideon checked the employee roster. They all report directly to Victor. Lucien looked at the frozen image of Alara walking away alone. For 11 months, she hadn't been hiding from mirrors. She had been hiding from people. He stood and headed for the door. Where are you going? Gideon asked. Lucien's answer was calm. I'm done investigating paperwork. It's time I asked Alara what no one else ever bothered to ask. As he reached the servants' corridor, he saw Alara kneeling on the floor, quietly sewing the torn sleeve of the same old grey coat. She looked up in surprise. I'm sorry, sir. I'll have it repaired before dinner. Lucien looked at the needle in her hand, then at the coat, then back at her. He asked only one question. Who convinced you that you weren't worth a new one? Alara's hand froze. For the first time since she arrived at Ashcroft Estate, she didn't know how to answer. Alara lowered the needle slowly. Lucien's question lingered in the quiet servants' corridor. Who convinced you that you weren't worth a new one? For several seconds, she couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know. Because she had never stopped to think about it. Finally, she smiled the same small, careful smile she always wore. No one, sir. I just didn't want to be a burden. Lucian studied her face. She believed those words. That was what unsettled him most. Not anger, not fear, acceptance. Before he could say another word, Victor Hale appeared at the end of the corridor. "There you are," he said with a polite smile. "The florist is waiting in the ballroom. We need every available maid." His eyes briefly settled on Elara. "And please change into something less noticeable." Elara instinctively looked down at the torn grey coat. "I'm sorry. I'll stitch it again after work." Lucian's expression hardened. "No." Both of them turned toward him. "You won't wear that coat again." Victor forced a laugh. "Sir, we don't have another one in her size." Lucian looked directly at him. "Then explain why the invoices say otherwise." Victor's smile disappeared. The corridor fell silent. Without another word, Lucian walked away. But before leaving, he quietly spoke to Gideon. "Bring me every uniform purchased during the last 2 years. And don't let Victor know where you're searching." Gideon nodded once. He understood. This investigation had become much larger than missing clothing. That evening, the estate hosted one of its largest charity galas. Politicians, business leaders, foreign investors. The mansion glittered beneath thousands of crystal lights. Elara spent the evening serving drinks while trying to keep the torn sleeve hidden behind a folded serving towel. As she passed through the ballroom, 2 wealthy guests began whispering. "Poor girl. That uniform barely fits. I suppose that's the best she can do." Elara kept walking. She had heard comments like those her entire life. She no longer reacted, but someone else did. From across the ballroom, Lucian heard every word. He watched as Elara instinctively lowered her shoulders and pulled the oversized coat tighter around herself. Not to stay warm, to disappear. At that moment, Gideon quietly approached. "I found the storage records." Lucian accepted the folder without taking his eyes off Elara. Inside were inventory lists showing dozens of unused Maid uniforms. Several were exactly her size. None had ever been issued. Attached to every approval form was the same signature, Victor Hale. Lucian closed the folder. His jaw tightened. So she was lied to. For 11 months. Gideon nodded. And it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Across the room, Elara accidentally brushed against a guest while trying to avoid another group of laughing socialites. The oversized sleeve caught the edge of a silver tray. Crystal glasses crashed onto the marble floor. The music stopped. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. Elara immediately bent down, apologizing over and over as she gathered the broken glass with trembling hands. "I'm so sorry. It was my fault." "No," Lucian said. His voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "It wasn't." He walked toward her, then looked directly at every guest in the room. "The only mistake made tonight was allowing someone to spend 11 months believing she deserved to hide." No one spoke. Lucian turned to Gideon. "Tomorrow morning, I want the finest tailor in the city standing in this mansion." Then he looked back at Elara. "For once, I want you to see yourself the way the rest of us should have seen you from the beginning." Elara froze. She had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. For the first time, someone wasn't asking her to hide. Someone was asking her to be seen. The following morning, Ashcroft Estate was unusually quiet. No deliveries, no meetings, no guests. Instead, 3 luxury vehicles stopped in front of the mansion. The city's most respected tailor, Beatrice Rowan, stepped out carrying rolls of fine fabric alongside a team of assistants. Every employee watched in confusion. Victor Hale frowned. "I thought the boss had business meetings today." "He does," Gideon replied. "This is one of them." Moments later, Elara was called to the west drawing room. She hesitated before entering. The room had been transformed into a private fitting studio. Silk fabrics covered long tables. Sketchbooks lay open beside measuring tapes. Beatrice greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Elara." She looked around nervously. "I think there's been a mistake." "There hasn't." Lucian's voice came from behind her. He stepped into the room. "I asked them to come for you." Elara immediately shook her head. "Sir, that's not necessary. I've worn that uniform for almost a year. I can keep wearing it," Lucian answered quietly. "That's exactly why we're here." Beatrice approached with a measuring tape. "May I?" Elara nodded uncertainly. The fitting began. Waist, shoulders, sleeves. Then Beatrice paused. She gently examined the old grey coat lying across a chair. A puzzled expression crossed her face. She turned the garment inside out. Her fingers followed several uneven seams. Finally, she looked toward Lucian. This wasn't altered because it was old. It was altered on purpose. The room fell silent. "What do you mean?" Lucian asked. Beatrice laid the coat flat across the table. The shoulders were narrowed. The sleeves were lengthened. The waist was deliberately widened. She pointed to rough stitching hidden beneath the lining. Someone changed the proportions so the person wearing it would always believe it was the wrong size. Elara stared at the coat. For months, she had blamed her own body. She believed she was too large, too different, too difficult to fit, but the coat had been made to deceive her from the beginning. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. "I thought." She struggled to finish the sentence. "I thought there was something wrong with me." Lucian remained silent. His hands slowly tightened into fists. For nearly a year, someone hadn't simply denied her a proper uniform. They had quietly taught her to doubt herself every single day. Beatrice finished taking the final measurement, then smiled gently. "There is nothing unusual about your figure. You don't need different measurements. You needed clothes that were actually made for you." Elara closed her eyes. Those simple words broke something she had carried for years. Not because they praised her, because for the first time, someone spoke about her body without judgment. Lucian walked toward the window, keeping his back to the room for a long moment. When he finally turned around, his voice was calm. "No employee in this estate will ever wear another person's discarded uniform again." Then he looked directly at Elara. "And you will never have to hide inside clothes that were designed to make you disappear." For the first time since she arrived at Ashcroft Estate, Elara didn't lower her eyes. She looked back at him, not with fear, but with the smallest spark of confidence beginning to return. Neither of them noticed Victor Hale standing silently outside the half-open door. His face had turned pale, because he finally understood Lucian was no longer investigating a missing budget. He was uncovering every cruel decision that Victor had buried over the years. 2 days later, Beatrice Rowan returned with the finished gowns. No extravagant jewels, no glittering embroidery, just elegant designs tailored with quiet precision. Each dress had been made to fit Elara exactly as she was. Nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated, nothing to make her appear smaller or larger. Beatrice gently held up the first gown, a deep emerald dress with clean lines and soft fabric that moved effortlessly in the light. "I'd like you to try this one." Elara hesitated. "I've never worn a dress like that." Beatrice smiled kindly. "That's why today is important." Minutes later, Elara stepped into the dressing room. She closed the door. The room fell silent. She slowly slipped out of the old grey coat. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, lying across the chair. It suddenly looked much heavier than she remembered. Not because of the fabric, because of everything it had made her believe. She carefully put on the new gown, then turned toward the full-length mirror. Her breathing stopped. The woman reflected in the glass looked familiar, yet completely different. The dress didn't change her figure. It simply fit. For the first time in years, her shoulders were no longer hidden beneath oversized fabric. Her posture seemed taller, her smile softer. A tear quietly rolled down her cheek. "I don't recognize her." Beatrice stepped beside her. "That's because you've spent too long looking at yourself through someone else's judgment." A gentle knock sounded on the door. "May I come in?" It was Lucien. Beatrice looked at Ilara. She nodded. Lucien entered slowly. For a brief moment, he said nothing. Not because the dress was beautiful, but because the woman wearing it finally looked comfortable standing inside her own skin. Ilara immediately lowered her eyes. Instinct. The same habit she had carried for years. Lucien quietly walked to the mirror. He stood beside her reflection, then spoke without looking away. "The coat never hid your body." Ilara slowly looked up. "It hid the woman you stopped believing in." Silence filled the room. Those words reached somewhere no compliment ever could. She whispered, "I always thought people laughed because of how I looked." Lucien gently shook his head. "They laughed because it was easier than questioning their own cruelty." He turned toward her. "I don't want you to wear these dresses because they're expensive. I want you to wear them because they're honest. They fit the person you really are." For the first time, Ilara didn't pull at her sleeves, didn't cross her arms, didn't search for something to hide behind. She simply stood there, looking at herself, accepting herself. Outside the fitting room, Gideon hurried down the hallway carrying a folder. He stopped beside Lucien. "We found the missing accounts. There are far more than uniform budgets." Lucien's expression hardened. "How much?" Gideon exhaled slowly. "Enough to prove Victor didn't just steal money. He built an entire system around deciding which employees deserved dignity, and which ones didn't." Lucien looked back at Ilara. The dress she wore had restored more than confidence. It had exposed the truth about everyone who had tried to take it away. He folded the accounting file closed. "It's time. No more investigations. No more questions. Tomorrow, everyone in this estate learns the truth." The following morning, every employee of Ashcroft Estate was ordered to gather inside the grand ballroom. No music played. No guests were invited. Only the people who lived and worked within the mansion stood quietly beneath the crystal chandeliers. At the front of the room stood Lucien Ashcroft. Beside him were Gideon Cross and several accountants carrying boxes filled with financial records. Victor Hale stood near the center of the crowd, still trying to appear composed. Lucien looked across the room before speaking. 3 days ago, I believed this investigation was about stolen money." He paused. "I was wrong." His voice remained calm. "It was about stolen dignity." The room fell silent. Gideon opened the first box and placed several documents on a long table. "Over the past 7 years," he announced, "uniform budgets were approved every season." He lifted another folder. "Yet dozens of employees were denied replacements." Another document followed. Requests from older workers were rejected. Another. Requests from injured employees disappeared. Another. And every maid whose measurements didn't match the standard sizing was told exactly the same lie. Lucien finished the sentence himself. "We don't have your size." Several employees lowered their heads. Some began quietly crying. For years they had believed they were the problem. Now they realized someone had carefully taught them to believe that. Victor finally stepped forward. "I did what was necessary." His voice echoed across the ballroom. "This estate represents power, perfection, discipline." He looked directly at Lucien. "I refused to lower those standards." A stunned silence followed. Then Lucien asked one simple question. "So your definition of perfection Was making decent people feel ashamed of themselves. Victor didn't answer. He couldn't, because every document on the table already had. Lucien turned toward the employees. Look around. Slowly, people raised their heads. For years, you believed respect had to be earned by looking a certain way. You were wrong. He looked at Elara, who stood quietly near the back of the room, wearing the emerald dress Beatrice had made for her. The old grey coat was gone. Not because she had become someone different, because she had finally stopped hiding. Lucien continued. The greatest mistake in this estate was never an old uniform. It was allowing good people to believe they deserved less than everyone else. He turned back to Victor. You're dismissed. Effective immediately. Security officers stepped forward. Victor looked around the ballroom, expecting someone to defend him. No one moved. As he was escorted away, several employees exchanged emotional glances. Not because a manager had lost his job, because, for the first time in years, they no longer felt invisible. Lucien walked toward Elara. The entire room watched. He stopped in front of her and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. You worked in my home for almost a year. You were treated unfairly, and I never noticed. He lowered his head. I should have. The ballroom became completely silent. No one had ever seen Lucien Ashcroft apologize to an employee. Elara's eyes filled with tears. You noticed now, she whispered, and that changed everything. Lucien smiled for the first time. Not the smile of a mafia boss. The smile of a man who had finally understood that true strength was not measured by power, but by the courage to restore another person's dignity. A month later, Ashcroft Estate opened its doors for its annual charity gala. The mansion looked as magnificent as ever. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. A string quartet filled the ballroom with quiet music. Yet something had changed. Not the building. The people inside it. Every member of the household now wore uniforms tailored to fit them properly. No borrowed coats. No worn-out sleeves. No one was expected to hide who they were, simply to belong. Near the grand staircase, Elara stood quietly outside the ballroom. In front of her were 3 gowns Beatrice Rowan had designed especially for her. For the first time in her life. No one told her which one to wear. Beatrice smiled. Which one feels most like you? Elara looked at each dress. Weeks earlier, she would have chosen the darkest color, the one that attracted the least attention. Today, she reached for the emerald gown. Not because it made her look smaller, not because it made her look different, because it made her feel like herself. When she stepped into the ballroom, conversations faded. Guests turned. Not in surprise, not in mockery, in admiration. Lucien watched from the far end of the room. He didn't walk toward her immediately. He simply smiled. Not because the gown was beautiful, because she no longer tried to disappear inside it. Elara crossed the ballroom with calm, confident steps. For the first time, she wasn't pulling at her sleeves. She wasn't lowering her head. She wasn't apologizing for taking up space. She had finally stopped hiding. Lucien met her at the center of the room. You chose the emerald one. She smiled. I did. It suits you. She looked at him for a moment before quietly answering. No. It suits the woman I finally allowed myself to become. Lucien's smile widened. He turned toward the gathered guests and employees. I have one final announcement. The ballroom fell silent. Beginning today, every employee of Ashcroft Estate will receive clothing tailored to fit them. No exceptions. No favoritism. No one will ever be asked to wear another person's discarded uniform again. He paused before adding, and no one in this house will ever be judged by a number on a clothing label. Applause slowly spread through the ballroom. Many employees wiped away quiet tears. Some had waited years to hear words like those. Lucien looked back at Elara. The oversized coat never defined you. She nodded. I know. It only reminded me how long I spent hiding. He gently offered his hand. She accepted it, without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the center of the ballroom, as the orchestra began another song. Across the room, the old gray coat rested inside a simple wooden display case. Not as a symbol of shame, but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity can be stolen one small decision at a time, and restored by one person willing to finally notice. Outside the estate, the city would always remember Lucien Ashcroft as the ruthless mafia boss. But inside those walls, the people who worked for him remembered something else. He was the man who looked at a torn coat and saw the invisible woman hiding inside it. From that day forward, Elara never again chose clothes to make herself disappear. She chose them to remind herself that she never needed a different body to deserve respect. She only needed the courage to stop believing the lies someone else had stitched into her life.